Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Victoriously Yours, Titans of Manhattan, Book 4 by Anise Storm, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue, Kenzie, Houston, Texas. Torn from the pages of my book, our love story was over before it ever really began. Well, that was if it was even considered one to begin with. The chapter had been so short, yet it also been both the best and worst time of my entire life. As I sat on the cold, hard ledge atop Courtland Hall, regret and shame filled me. I just can't escape you, I lamented as I realized who the Courtland was on this particular building. No, it wasn't Jonas, but generation after generation of his family. I'd heard about those before him. Who hadn't? Yet I still deluded myself into believing that he was different. Maybe I'd just hoped that you were. He wasn't different, though. As I recently found out, Jonas made the things his elder brother did appear mild in comparison. Body counts aside, I'd never even heard of Logan Courtland engaging in the same deceitful activities as his younger brother. Of course, just because I hadn't heard about it didn't mean it never happened. After all, he had to have learned it from someone. Still, as the warm spring breeze lifted the loose, dark tendrils of hair framing my face, none of that counted. It'd only be a matter of time before everyone at Spencer Academy knew what Jonas had done. More importantly, they'd know what I had done too. Despair began to fill me at that prospect. Good girls like me didn't have premarital sex, and especially with the captain of the football team. But I had, and it had been the best night of my young life. Now the pleasure I'd felt then threatened to strangle me like a noose around my neck. What am I going to do? I didn't have any friends, and there was no one to share my despair. If Daddy finds out? My thoughts drifted to my father. George Broderick, minister of Life Point Baptist Church, would surely have me sent off to a convent, or worse. Thomas and Ethel Broderick had a farm in midwestern Nebraska, and the very idea of being shipped off to live with my grandparents had me looking down at the pavement below. I scrubbed my hands down my face, the movement made easier by the dampness of my cheeks, courtesy of the tears I'd been crying for the last hour. Everyone in school had to know what he'd done to me by now, and so I certainly couldn't show my face inside those halls. Not now, and maybe not ever again. I'd been duped and would be the mockery of our entire school. God knows I'd heard about every other conquest of Jonas's, although he'd denied most of them to me. People just like to talk, he'd explained, and I'd stupidly believed it all. It hadn't been the only lies I'd fallen for over the last couple of months. I really like you, Kenzie. You're everything I never knew I wanted. I sarcastically laughed at those words which now viciously taunted me. I care about you. Those had been the worst because they'd made me discard my values, principles, and common sense in a pile at my feet. They're all going to laugh at me, I cried out loud. Why, oh, why had I believed Jonas Courtland? I stood and started to pace back and forth. I'd made such a mess of things, and just the thought of having to see him for the last couple of months of school would be torture. We were even seated within arm's reach of one another at graduation, which seemed like an eternity to this, when now it was closer than ever. A few more errant tears rolled down my cheeks as they stubbornly refused to stop falling. I had to think of a way out of this situation I'd stupidly put myself in. If only there was a way to go back in time to the period where no one knew who I was or even cared. If I could go back there, I'd certainly make sure to steer well clear of Jonas Courtland. I couldn't, and now I had to quickly think of a solution. Maybe it wasn't even as bad as I thought. After all, the only one who would possibly tell my father would be Mila. The girl's mother, Caroline, was the biggest busybody in the entire congregation. The woman would latch onto this gossip like a dog with a bone and spread it around to anyone and everyone she saw. The news would then reach my father. I could already see next Sunday's sermon being directed at me and what my father considered a sin. We'd only moved to Houston last summer, and now it didn't look like I'd even make it here a year this time. Ever since I was 10, my family moved from one place to another for a multitude of reasons. I'd never been the cause, but this incident would certainly change all of that. I'd brought shame to my entire family, and I'd never lived this down. Fuck. Cursing was something else my father considered a sin, but by this time I was too upset to care. Sirens blared off in the distance, or at least I thought they'd been far enough away until the shrill shrieking got closer. Seconds later, I realized 2 police cars and an ambulance were out front of the school. Sensing the oddity here and forgetting my own problems for a moment, I peered over the ledge again just in time to see the officers and paramedics file out of their vehicles. "Mackenzie Broderick!" one of the uniformed officers called through his megaphone. It was then when I realized exactly why they were there. The police had been called because of me. Shocked, I stepped back. Did the authorities think I was trying to jump? Of course they did. Why else would they be gathered floors below me while calling out my name? Just great. If the entire student population didn't know what Jonas had done to me, they would now. I'd be the center of every salacious story told in those halls. Everyone would want to know what I had done and why, and the rumor mill would run rampant with different variations of the truth. Most would involve them talking about how I was suicidal. My anxiety kicked up a notch, and I wobbled as a faint sense of lightheadedness passed over me. This was bad. More than that, actually. Panic welled up inside. Surely I could just go back into the school and explain how this was all a mistake. I began to shake, knowing full well the damage had already been done now. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to go. My parents had to have been called by now. Just the thought of disappointing my father made me sick with disgust. It had only been 2 years since his heart attack, and if this didn't send him to an early grave, my actions, however incorrectly perceived as they were, would send him there for sure. I began to pace once more, and at the sound of a familiar voice, I turned and glared at the intruder. "Step away from the ledge, baby," Jonas instructed as he took a step forward. "Don't you ever call me that again. You stay right over there where I can fucking see you." My fear over everything was replaced by my anger at the boy in front of me. Just over 6 foot with an athletic build, he was physically imposing. He was also so damn striking that the mere sight of him still made my chest ache. He was a redhead, but no one would ever call him names like Ginger or Carrot Top. He was so fucking gorgeous and a legend at school. God, I needed to quit ogling him because it would only build up his ego even more, but it was easier said than done. After all, it had only been days earlier when he had stood behind me and lowered the straps of my prom dress. I could still feel the caress of his breath as he trailed kisses along my bare collarbone. His hands had lightly groped me in all the right places that night. Even now, my traitorous body had still yearned for more. Thankfully, it was my head in control now. Well, maybe partially my emotions as well, but definitely not my recently awakened libido. When Jonas ignored my request and took another few steps in my direction, I backed up instinctively. Just weeks earlier, he'd cornered me much like he was trying to do now. The only difference was that I wouldn't be falling backward onto a soft bed, but would instead fall to my death. He must have realized how perilously close I was to the edge of the roof because he suddenly backed away and threw his hands up in the air. "Whoa, I'll back up, but please just come back inside the school." Even his voice did things to me as a shiver racked my entire frame. My chest was aching by now, the rapid pace of my heart rate causing the organ to clench painfully as it nearly beat out of my chest. It was also breaking as I looked at the boy I'd given every part of myself to. He'd never cherished it, just like my father had worn since I was 12 and developed breasts. Boys can never appreciate your gifts or return them. As you grow older, you'll be faced with temptation, but you must trust in your faith and resist. He'd gone on to tell me the importance of saving myself until marriage, but that warning and message had gone unheeded, because I had bought all of Jonas's lies and fallen into his bed anyway. The magnitude of that mistake weighed heavily upon me. They think I'm crazy. I was merely stating the obvious, and at the look of concern on his face, I laughed sarcastically, fitting the very image I was hoping to shed. "How could you fucking do this to me?" As Jonas opened his mouth to speak, I raised my hand to silence him. His expression softened even more, and I could have sworn I saw a twinge of regret in his hazel eyes until he blinked. He stepped forward again, causing me to step back. The sudden motion sent a wave of nausea rolling over me. Even in the midst of all that, I stupidly stared at him with such longing. It hadn't been just one night I needed to force myself to forget, but rather all the weeks that led up to it. He'd said and done all the right things, making me fall so completely in love. I actually considered changing colleges to follow him. It hadn't been the only stupid thing I'd done. In my head, I'd planned our entire future together, from marrying sometime between our junior and senior year of college to having 3 kids, a boy and 2 girls. Maybe I am crazy. I'd seen and planned for a future he never intended to give me. All of his actions and words had been nothing but lies. They were levels to the game he'd won, and it didn't matter what he'd taken from me as long as he emerged the victor. Looking back at it now, our entire relationship had been one sick and twisted game, and I'd been nothing more than a pawn. The legend of his brother's reputation would be succeeded by Jonas, and when I ended up plummeting to my death, no one else would ever be able to top him. He'd be that high score others in the arcade strived to beat but never came close to. A sob escaped me even as I wobbled angrily on my feet. I trusted you, I managed to get out between shallow breaths. It was understatement at this point, but all I could audibly voice. I hate you, I added seconds later. I'm sorry, Jonas said, finally speaking despite my desire for him not to. Sorry? My voice elevated just before I released another sob. You are sorry? But as a person, not for what you've done to me. Hyperventilation got the best of me as my anxiety reached its peak. Another wave of dizziness passed over me and I stumbled. Frantically, I tried to grab onto anything. Jonas, probably having seen my current state, rushed to my aid. I held onto his arm, but I refused to look into his face. God, how I wanted to, just so I could memorize it one more time. He was so fucking beautiful, but I knew it only hurt more. Instead of sneaking a peek, I closed my eyes and savored the feel of his arms around me, knowing they'd never be there again. Even that moment, like every other one between us, was short-lived, because what felt like mere seconds later, I was being pulled away from him. Everything else happened in a blur, and I slipped into unconsciousness, only coming to when in the back of the ambulance with my worried mother by my side. It'd be the last time I'd see the Houston skyline as the ambulance rushed me to the hospital. But then again, I'd already known that. It was also the last time I'd see the boy who made me dream, only to viciously rip it away.